This has a hodgepodge of things, but the very first thing is mercantilism, which some of you went into this and if you were in AP World History. But the idea, the main goal, is for the mother country, and the mother country is who is going to take the raw products from the colonies. They are going to make finished products. You want to have the value of the imports to be greater than the value of your exports to be greater than the value of your imports. Doesn't mean more, because here's where you look at things. Who makes more money, the cotton farmer or the company that makes shirts?
The company that makes shirts.
Who makes more money, the lumberjack or the furniture maker?
Furniture.
And this is where, for the colonies, the colonies will give these raw products, which the mother country then converts into manufactured goods. So you might have 10 ships that are full of cotton, and then only one that goes out with clothing. But the value of that one might be more valuable than all 10 of the raw products coming in. No matter which colony it is, this is the purpose that you would have. Some, it was easier than others in the beginning. For Spain, they just basically got the gold and silver from the Indians that lived there. For England, it would be products that they would have. Tobacco, other things that will be produced along the way. But again, the balance of trade is supposed to be favorable to the mother country. Now, here's where I want you to look, and then come back where we went over various places that would become the United States or our neighbors. Who was Florida's mother country in 1750?
Spain.
Okay, Spain. Now, Florida's not a good example of this because we were actually almost like a welfare type country, because why did Spain have Florida? And it was protection for what?
Pirates.
Okay, from pirates with the Gulf Stream as they would go. So that is where they did not invest very much money in the time that they had Florida, but that was our mother country. 1750, who's Georgia's mother country?
England.
Okay, that would be England, where it was started, or Britain. Canada's in 1750.
French.
Okay, the French. Okay, they're getting furs. I don't know if I'm in the notes. I think I have some others. How about if we were to say New Mexico?
That was Mexico.
Okay, that would be Spain. Okay, not Mexico, because Mexico's not around yet.
Okay.
There, it will be Spain. Did I have any others in your notes?
New York.
Okay, New York, 1750.
The Dutch.
1750.
Oh.
Okay, it'll be the British.
That's a shame.
All right, and so this is where you have to try. Remember, I told you don't have to know exact dates, but you got to know the general time period. By the time we get to 1750, which is close to that 1776 that you should know, we are close to where that is where the English have had them for quite a while. Now, mercantilism is one word you must know. Second word that there's three words that go together. If there's one, you should be looking for all three of these. Mercantilism, second one is Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts are laws that were passed by Britain that enforced mercantilism. They said that if you were Britain, you were only allowed to trade with British, whether it be to Great Britain or another British colony. So they just enforced the idea of mercantilism. The third word that goes with it and is connected with that is salutary neglect. What happened here is that a lot of times the British neglected to follow their rules. They kind of looked the other way, or they were busy with wars or fighting other things. For the most part, the Americans on the colonies, they for the most part obeyed these rules. But sometimes, let's say if Kyle was a shipper coming out of Boston, he might have it where 4 of his ships does everything right, but he has one that goes into a Spanish and traded with them because he can make a little more money. And for the most part, the British look the other way. And I have on here, it's kind of like speed limits. Does every time you speed, do you get pulled over?
No.
I mean, a lot of you're driving down the road, and then you see Mr. Police Officer. First thing you do is you look at the speedometer, and you say, oh no, I'm going 59, it's 50, and you spend the next 30 seconds in the rearview mirror saying, don't make a U-turn, don't make a U-turn. But this is where, as you're going along.
No, as soon as I pass my speed up, if I get away.
Meanwhile, then you drive through Dun Ellen and you get pulled over for going 37 and a 35, and you get a ticket. Yeah, don't speed in Dun Ellen.
Or Stark.
County tag. Oh yeah, Stark or any of those when you're going on 301. But this is where you kind of look at things. For the most part, they they ignored it. But then when they started enforcing it, that's where the Americans later on would get upset. And some of the side effects we will have from this. We're going to build more ships. The other thing, where we have that geography part about the secondary ports. If Kyle is coming out of Boston and he knows one of his ships is going to have, or he is smuggling in stuff, he's not going to have him go into Boston, where the king has people that are checking the ships. He's going to have him sail into Hartford or some of the smaller ports, those secondary ports. And we will have this independence, part of it because, yes, we are breaking rules. But as we are growing up, think of teenagers, do you get a little rebellious, start breaking a few rules? I mean, none of you, but some other teenagers. But this is where, for the Americans, we were kind of testing it and becoming more independent. And here's the connection in. What happens when, especially after French and Indian War, the British started really enforcing these rules? What do we Americans do?
We got mad.
Yeah, we got mad. All right, even though, I mean, they were just enforcing the rules that had always been there, we were upset. You must realize that some of our richest Americans we will have are going to get rich off of smuggling. One of the richest men around in 1776, who was real upset because a couple of his ships had been captured, some of them burnt by the British, was this guy by the name of John Hancock. And he becomes extremely wealthy by being a smuggler and breaking the laws of Britain. So that is one reason why for him, it didn't really matter a whole lot for him putting a big old signature on the Declaration of Independence because he was already wanted by the British. So for him, that treason was innocent. All right, this next thing that comes up here, this is another thing that you would have had in AP World History. We're going to look at just on the American side of the triangular trade. The idea of a triangular trade is that you are never have your ship empty. Any of you that your families are involved in trucking industry, you will want to make sure that you are never driving down the road with an empty truck. So if you've been hired and you're taking a load of manatee ribs to Atlanta, you don't want. I mean, what else are we going to bring out of Citrus County?
Cooter turtles.
Okay, cooter turtles, or realistically, okay, Floral City strawberries. We're gonna actually have the strawberry. You get to Atlanta, you're not going to drive back to Atlanta without having a backhaul. You want something, even if you just want to pay for some of your diesel. Well, you never want your ship to be empty. So this is where you will have triangular trade. The one that makes it for one of the biggest ones in American history, and it's not everyone like this, though, makes it easier because of what they were doing. They're all connected. You will have from New England, and sometimes they would go by Britain and sell some of this, but sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they would go directly to the second part, where it's more of a triangle instead of a trapezoid. But the product they would have is rum. Now, why would anybody want to buy rum?
Slaves.
Because they're alcoholics.
They're alcoholics, or just to drink, but yeah, a lot of people, they drink rum. And our Puritans were very good at making rum. One place they sold a lot of it was in Africa. They would sell their rum, and guess what product they would pick up in Africa?
Slaves.
Slaves. And this would be their most profitable leg of the trip. They would then take the slaves, more times than not, they would take it to the Caribbean. Realize that our ships that were selling out of New England and carrying slaves, they would probably 80–90% of the time be taking the slaves to the Caribbean. There was more slaves there than what would be American colonies. Sometimes they would come to the south. But then they would take it to the Caribbean, and from there they would end up, least profitable leg, having molasses to New England. Now that leg that went from Africa to the New World was called the Middle Passage. And this is where sometimes the ships would be overpacked. You will have it where a lot of people have died, diseases that went on these slave trips. Now, this is a triangle that makes it nice and simple. Again, it really wasn't always that simple, but to try to have that with a triangular trade. One reason why they will have this triangular trade is to avoid those navigation acts. Because they could say, oh, we're heading, and sometimes they would go to a colony that was by the British, but other times they wouldn't. But they would say, we're on the way to Barbados. I mean, they didn't go to Barbados, they would instead go to Puerto Rico or someplace like that. But again, they're making money along the way. By the way, what is the molasses used to make in New England?
Rum.
Rum. Molasses is made out of, or rum is made from molasses. So that is where they are actually connected there, because the sugarcane farms in the Caribbean is where the molasses comes from, and we're a lot of time, and most of the time, those plantations use slaves as their labor. All right, here's another thing you kind of look at this picture, and you see, again, it's not a perfect triangle, but you can kind of see as things are going from one area to another. But notice from the New World, we have the raw products and we have manufactured goods. Why? Well, oil.
It was used for lamps.
Okay, for lamps and even some other things, and there's some of our early machines. As England was starting to go through the Industrial Revolution, you would have to use that oil. We did not have oil that we use today from the ground. All right, consumerism, keeping the same idea for Americans. Early on, our colonies will end up liking to buy stuff. Is that very American?
Yeah.
I like to buy stuff.
Yeah. Early stages of the Industrial Revolution, we like to show off our wealth. Americans don't do that today, do they?
No, of course not.
Here's another thing, the average American was wealthier than the average person from Britain.
Ooh.
By 20%. So if you lived in Boston, New York, you were wealthier already than your European counterpart. And so this is something that we spent the money that we had in there. Believe it or not, advertising. Americans, we'd never be distracted by advertising as we are coming up to the Super Bowl.
I can't wait for the
where
Super
you have
Bowl.
people that tell, oh, be quiet, commercials are coming on. Okay, but this is
Just the
where
Super Bowl commercials.
one of the reasons why we will have is we will end up having more we have more newspapers than they have. We have a higher percentage of people that can read. And so these are in the almanacs, these are in the journals, these newspapers that are going. We have a better postal system that is delivering this. We will have a merchant class that emerges from here. And all of these things, again, the idea of American advertising, consumerism. This is not something that came about in recent time. Slavery, coming back on this and a couple broad things. In the beginning, all 13 colonies had slavery. What happened after Bacon's Rebellion?
The northern colonies kind of.
And slavery will go up, and inter-servanthood would go down. And it's not just because of Bacon's Rebellion, and this is where for a lot of you in your reflection questions, it also is because, and one of the main reasons that also there will be the fact that the price of slaves will go down and the price of indentured servants go up. But Bacon's Rebellion will contribute. And as you can see here, from 1660, 1680, 1700s, late 1600s, where we go to a higher percentage of slaves to indentured servants.
While we're on the indentured servant thing, I know that a lot of the contracts were like 4 or 5 years, but why weren't the males, because I know the males were supposed to get like tools and stuff after they left and like maybe a bit of land, why weren't a lot of the contracts actually fulfilled?
Because a lot of times this is where the people in power didn't have to. All right, they really weren't prosecuted for it. Again, the rich and wealthy weren't, and this wasn't with all the cases and that you'd have, but yeah, there were cases that it wasn't.
So it's basically just, I'm going to tell you we're not signing anything, I'm just telling you this.
Or they would say, well, you didn't fulfill all of your contract, you didn't work hard all this time.
Okay.
So yeah. All right, why would it die out in the northern colonies but continue in the southern colonies? Mark?
Because most of their crops and stuff they do weren't as high maintenance as the things in the south.
Right, and this is where it comes down to economics, crops. It is not, oh, the northern colonies, they were more moral. Has nothing to do with that. It comes down to economics. The type of crops that the South had were labor intensive. And here's where the other side comes in. How were the northern colonies not blameless when it came to the growth of slavery?
They were still involved with the slave trade?
Yeah. The slaves that came to the South through the triangular trade, they were settling most of the time on ships owned by northerners. Now, don't try to oversimplify it and say, oh, well, slavery died out in New York, all those slaves moved to South. No, they didn't, because this was over a gradual time period there. But the slave trade, and even up into the time of the Civil War, you will have that northern areas will control the slave trade that you have. All right, slave culture. Sometimes it's where we always just look at slavery, but there was a culture that had emerged out of this. It'll be separate, and they will blend things with the white society, with some of their culture, and things that will come from Africa even. Gula is a hybrid language of English and some African languages. It is actually a dying language. There are people that are recording it because some of the islands where free slaves had lived on South Carolina, North Carolina, but especially down on islands of Georgia, where they've been isolated, this language had kind of existed there. But now, it's one that as technology has finally got to some of these islands in the last couple of decades, there is no reason if you're a person growing up that people around you aren't speaking that language, they're speaking English. So they're recording this. Well, actually, in the next like 50 years or so, we will have a lot of languages in the world die. About 80% of the languages will die. Because, I mean, you think in North America, some of the Inuit and Eskimo languages that now that they have been exposed to the world, they're not going to learn their native tongue because they're going to learn English or French. In China, we now have had a couple decades in a row where Mandarin Chinese is the official language, where China had all kinds of different Chinese languages, but they made that official one. I know like 25 years ago, there was only about 20% of the Chinese actually spoke Mandarin Chinese. Now it's higher in percentage. So you have a lot of these languages dying out. Gula is one of those. We will also have the religion will have the mix. This is where you can kind of see with Tituba and the Salem witchcraft trials and some of the ideas that you'll have with the voodoo. And so that'll come also from the Caribbean. Do not try to go and think of it here that all the slaves were mistreated or they are all treated great, because we will have a wide range. You will have from some that are almost like a family member to some that are truly mistreated. But the one thing, and this is where later on we're going to kind of look at some of the slave rebellions. We will in 1639 have a slave rebellion, the Stono Rebellion. So when you see Stono Rebellion, notice the slave rebellion. If they are going to rebel, does that show that things were going real good for all the slaves?
No.
And it's where one thing to kind of look at that to know. Yeah.
When I did my report on the Brinkley Chapter 3, and when I came to the question for the early indentured and slavery, everyone, and this is, you really brought it up, everyone always thinks that slavery really was a horrible thing, and I mean, don't get me wrong, it was, but not all slaves were treated so terribly.
And this is where, and that part of that is where you kind of look at what Hollywood has, and it's a little bit easier to remember that. And again, it depends on the master. Same thing was true with the indentured servants.
I mean, if you really look at it, America was built in our early years on slavery. I mean, we got a lot of our culture today is still built on some of the things from the past.
And this is where, like we had like in the War today before, one of the reasons why we have some groups that yell for reparations today. Going back to something we had back at 5.3, one of our earliest, I know that was back in August, manumission. And this is where we will have some of the slave owners that will be freeing their slaves. Sometimes they might say that even though it wasn't an official indentured servanthood, but you will have some that say, listen, I'm hoping that economically in the next 5 years or 10 years that I will free you. This is not something just in Colonial. It will happen later on. Doesn't Uncle Tom's Cabin was actually written this way. The original owner of Uncle Tom was going to release him, but then he dies. And after he dies, he is part of the estate. He then gets sold to a bigger plantation. And then you see the other part of his life. But for vocabulary, we will have free. You will have some slaves that are actually able to go and do extra work, and if they do extra work, they will pay them extra, and they can take that money to buy their own freedom. So you have cases of that are occurring. Again, this is before and after the Revolutionary War, before we become a country. All right, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop on that part right there. All right, science and education, the Enlightenment. We'll look at the Enlightenment more on the idea with John Locke and some of his ideas that we have for government. But we will have, and this is one thing that we see for Americans, we do have a big interest in science. We like new things there, and that will cause more of it. Some of you in your Brinkley report had written about Ben Franklin, but we will have research in medicine there. One reason why we have this is our education level in what would be the colonies was higher. Reason being we were higher, mainly in the northern New England areas, was because of religion. The northern colonies, a lot of those came about for religion. Yes, ma'am.
You touched on John Locke. What era?
We'll get to John Locke in the next section. We'll have a whole section with the Declaration of Independence, and your life, liberty, and property will become part of your SFIs to know. We have a lot more newspapers, and we have a truly American thing of the almanac. What piece of literature is the almanac and our contribution as Americans to world literature?
Isn't it like a map? Or
Isn't it dates?
It's a whole lot of information. It's a whole mixture of things. I saw it the other day when I went to Tractor Supply Company, and they had the box of the 2014. Part of what they do is, and it is based for agriculture, they will tell you when you should plant your beans. When is the best time for fishing? Some of you that are hunters know about in Florida, South Moon Under. There are certain days and certain times that you have when it is a new moon and it is opposite of it in the middle of the day, when fish and animals are more likely to feed. There are times the moon phases that it is better to plant your beans or your wheat. So all of that is information. We also had, because Ben Franklin had the most famous with Poor Richard's Almanac, little short stories, and for Ben Franklin where he would have these little nifty sayings, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. So that is our contribution.
I thought that was Johnny Appleseed.
I went on an apple diet because of that.
Well, it's good. And actually, it's funny. Jon Stewart or Colbert, one of them was making fun of something because after one of these grants came about, and they found that if people eat more apples, they will be healthier. And I think it was Colbert was like, I wonder if we could ever think of a saying that would help people remember this. Going on about this. But that's where we'll look at it. We had a lot more newspapers. We also had the best postal system pretty much in the world, better than the European country, thanks again to Ben Franklin. Even though Ben Franklin, he was not a president, as some people think, he will make huge contributions in science and writing, even though it wasn't philosophy that he'll have. But he makes our postal system where we are almost twice as fast in communication as Britain and European countries. Which do we in America like to get information fast?
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's early on. And that is thanks to Night Riders. You know, those cars with computers in the kit.
Mm-hmm.
What were Night Riders before the 1980 show?
Horseback.
Yeah, the horseback ride. They would ride at night. We would actually deliver the mail faster. We would have them riding at night, delivering the mail so we could get it. And spreading newspapers because we had a lot more people that could read. And medicine. This is where our research comes in. And some of those people will say it's the American spirit. Are we not afraid sometimes to try something new? Here. And this is where Cotton Mather, early on, the Puritan preacher, he will actually, and something we learned from the Indians, they would take someone when they got smallpox, and they started, even though smallpox wasn't from the Indians, they started to go and with healthy people, giving them the smallpox. But that would go where they would build up their immune system. A lot of people did not believe to use that, and we will actually, by the time we get to the Revolutionary War, General Washington, when his soldiers start to get smallpox, he makes a decision that he advises on both sides, and will actually have those that are infected take some of that pox and cut open the skin and infect the healthy people. And it ends up working out, but it was something that people were scared after death. And can you imagine the trust people had to have in George Washington? When he's your general and says, all right, Derek, Hunter's dying, we're going to cut you open while you're healthy. We're going to take some of this disease that we know he's dying from, and we're going to put some of that right in your cut. You have to have a lot of trust in George Washington to say, yes, sir. But it ended up working out. All right, self-government. This is kind of a mixture of things. We have the House of Burgesses. We have the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. We have these various things where the British are allowing us to have some government. We have power. We have independence. What happens later on when they try to take some of that away? Yeah, and this is where the idea that we have in there, we're able to make our own laws. The king would appoint people in the largest cities, but outside of those cities, especially in the countryside, we have that rebellious spirit. And some people say that we even have that today, where the Tea Party, that anti-government, big government idea, its base is rural areas, not in the city that you would have. And so that's where it kind of plays into that rebellion that we'll have. Kind of a summary of various things for our colonial women that we had, but the Chesapeake colonies and the southern colonies will have, the women will have more power. You know, I kind of put that in quotation marks when they're single. And I know I had this in another section. If there are 4 or 5 male suitors for every female, can they use that to their advantage?
Maybe.
Now, the unfortunate thing is, for most women, once they got married, in some cases, the women, the way the state laws were written, not only did they lose their property, but pretty much the wording of the colony law was they became the property of their husband. So again, some women in the South kind of chose, sometimes as a widow or something, to stay single and have that. Going back to a vocabulary of words you should know from world history, most of our society was patriarchal, especially you kind of look at the Puritans. So much forward where we will have Anne Hutchinson, where she is preaching to men, and that is seen as heresy to do that. All right, what are midwives?
They birth.
Yeah, they help with babies, help with birth. Pretty much you really didn't want to see most of our doctors that we had at that time. Okay, because they are, I mean, you're sick, we're going to bleed you. Okay, and actually we know today there's a few things like with leeches, there are a few things that actually leeches are good for thinning the blood. But that is not the cure for everything there, but to get the bad spirits out. But this is where midwives kind of help because women were having, and the average was every other year, which for women, the doctors today say that women should not really have children more than every other year if they are very healthy and on a good diet. And some of these women are a lot more. Remember Anne Hutchinson, I think she had, I can't remember if it was 16, 17, or 18 children in less than a 20-year period.
What a beast.
It's like
Which women had a lower life expectancy than men? Guess why? Stress from what?
giving birth.
Yeah, childbirth. A lot of women would die in childbirth. Now, if a woman could survive to menopause, where they would no longer have children, usually they were pretty healthy. But again, so many complications that could happen, and this is where you hope you had a good midwife in there that would understand, hey, something is wrong here, and how do you take care of this problem in there? Notable women of the period, Anne Hutchinson. No, there are not many from this time period. Anne Hutchinson, but one other is Phyllis Wheatley. We did not know as much about Phyllis Wheatley until a few decades later, when they found all of these poems. And here is something culturally we actually did contribute to literature, because she wrote in the way that the Europeans looked at, even though it was an American style, and it was a little bit rough for the Europeans, but they saw it and they said, wow, this is actually good. It's none of that Ben Franklin stuff. All right, yeah, he's a funny guy, but all right, we have something. And like a lot of artists and writers, her fame comes about after her death. The College Board loves to have her on because you kind of look at things, again, how many women do we have before 1800 that we can really look at? So it is someone that we have, and even though it's literature, it is for Americans. She might be our first American writer that we have. And again, an African-American poet. All right, the Peter Zenger trial. I know we had this in our events last time, but notice the date, 1734. Long before we're thinking about becoming independent, but this is the American idea. he is on trial for criticizing the government. During the trial, and afterwards, is said to be innocent because he did not commit libel. Libel is when you print something untrue. He printed things that were bad about the governor, but they were true. And said, you're allowed to do that. And we will hold these things. The idea of freedom of speech, freedom of the press. We even have, and this is where I say due process. If you're accused of a crime, should you get a trial? And that's where for what would be the United States, we'll have it. We actually in the First Amendment, the right to petition. And really soon y'all are going to have to write out the Bill of Rights.
Are you saying?
And petition, yes. Take out piece of paper number 1 to 10, write the Bill of Rights in order. But this is where the right to petition means you have the right to criticize your government. You can write a letter criticizing here. And so that kind of falls in there. Here's where we kind of look at some of the differences between us and our cousins. We kind of look at the Britain as our cousins. More mobile socially, economically, and actually physically. Could an American, when things were going bad, decide, pack it up, I'm moving out west? Which is part of the problem that we will have when we decide to move out west, and the British will say, no, you're not allowed to move west of the mountains. And Daniel Boone says, what? All right, you can't tell me I can't move to this area. I got a town that's named after me. Of course, he named it. But this is where you kind of react. But socially, and we still have that, the American ideas. If you are the poorest person in this room, and you come back 26 years from now for your 25th reunion, does that mean you're still going to be the poorest person of all of you in here?
No.
No. You could be the richest. And that's kind of seen as an American ideal. We don't have this, okay, you're born into these class systems. And it's something that is seen as American. And we kind of were breaking away that British idea, that hierarchy. Now the South has some of that hierarchy, but other areas, and this is where, okay, keep bringing it up, you look at Pennsylvania, and you kind of see what is the model of what American ideals were. It would be Pennsylvania with the Quakers. We were wealthier. The part we had yesterday about the consumers. We like to buy stuff, we made more money. The average American was 20-25% wealthier than their tax-paying cousins that were paying a lot more taxes in London. We had a lot more people that could read and write, which again, that plugs into why we have more newspapers, we have almanacs, we have more of this idea with science. We were healthier. Why are we healthier?
Because we're doing more, we're more
Yeah,
active.
more diverse.
Trial and error.
And I heard a whole bunch of different things in here, and it does really have to do, food is the very thing. More diverse diet. Another thing we had, are we, yeah, we're spread out a lot more. And this is what kind of makes it. Diseases spread rampantly through a city. But if you're spread out, and we are more spread out, you can be healthier. That way. But diet would be one of the biggest things for a couple generations, where we're not having just one or two things. We have a lot more protein, which also made us, on average, more than 2 inches taller than our British cousins. You go a couple generations of having better health, you're going to naturally be taller. And if you have children that have a good diverse diet, they are going to be healthier and taller as they're growing. It used to be, they used to joke about little Chinamen. And today, the average person in China is a lot taller than what it was 25 years ago. Reason being, China has a better economy and they have a better diet. So now they are not getting stunted for a lot of the poor Chinese people, not getting stunted early in their life because they have a good diet.
Smaller than us still.
Average really isn't, pretty much if they're for most.
So,
And here's the key thing, and this is what you look at for Americans. We were more independent. We were more rebellious. Not just in government, but just our ideas, whether it be religion here, and that is what. And what has developed from, when was Jamestown?
1607.
To Declaration of Independence?
1776.
So you kind of look during that time period where we go from being British to being American. It does not happen overnight. It does not happen in 1 year. It does not happen in one generation. It takes several generations as we get further and further away from our British background that you kind of look at things and say, We're different. We're not the same as them. All right, this is where we kind of segue into the next section that we will have. It's the beginning of the end of this one. But we have the French and Indian War. Now, are the French and Indians fighting? No, who's fighting? The French and the British are the two big ones. But I'm going to oversimplify this. It's the English and their English colonies, which there are 13 colonies with part of that, against the French. Most of the Indians are on the French side, but there are some tribes that are on the side of the English. Not all right, but there are some. Like the Iroquois, there would be a couple of the Iroquois tribes that would fight on the English, some that would be more of them on the French. But not only that, on France's side, you have Spain, you have the Netherlands. In other words, it's pretty much Britain versus everybody else. And spoiler alert, who wins? Yeah, Britain. So the biggest countries in the world all start to fight each other, basically all ganging up on Britain, and Britain emerges victorious here. Now, the start of this happens, and this is those of you in world history, this is the 7 Years' War, which technically would last 9 years. Okay, yeah, the 100 Years' War was like 115 or something years also. But the area of what's called the middle grounds, we have Spain, we have England, we have the French. But this area in here kind of left to the Indians. We're kind of all arguing over it. When France says it's theirs, we're going to send some British over to say, no, it's not yours. And that will end up starting this world war. Now, I say it is a world war. Why is it a world war?
Because all the world is involved.
Well, not only is, well, it's mainly European countries there and the colonies, but it is fought on multiple continents. In fact, this is more of a world war than World War II, because it is fought in North America, some of the Caribbean, a little bit of skirmishes in South America, Africa, some in India for Asia, and of course in Europe they're fighting each other. But it starts in North America, starts in the Ohio River Valley. And here's where our father emerges. And who is the father of our country? George Washington. Although Ben Franklin's probably the father of a whole lot of people in our country, because he got around a bit. And there. Meanwhile, George Washington, we don't know if he ever even had any children, because he had no children of his own. We don't know if there were any illegitimate children. So our father, our country, may have had no children at all of his own.
Wait, when did the hookers come around?
That's after World War. Well, there were prostitutes before, but they called hookers after fighting Joe Hooker in the Civil War. But the French and Indian War starts. Notice 1754. The ending of it will be 1763. George Washington is with the British. The British march into the Ohio River Valley to tell the French that they got to get out. The problem is the French don't fight fair. How are you supposed to fight fair in those days?
You're supposed to line up in a line and fight on an open field or something like that.
Okay, line up. You might even plan, okay, on Saturday we're going to fight at this location. It's almost like, okay, we're going to have a soccer match at this time. And here, we're going to set up. Plus, officers are only supposed to shoot officers, enlisted men only enlisted men. Which the officers are the rich. And then there was like this unspoken rule that the officers actually don't shoot each other. So when the battle is actually being fought, it is the enlisted men fighting the enlisted men. And the officers aren't really even involved with things. Can you come back just a little bit? In about 5 minutes? Or if you want to sit in here a little bit. Yeah. You don't like him? Why don't you like Devin? Come on. Better watch out. But what ends up happening with this, the French don't fight fair. They hide behind trees. They set up an ambush. They shoot the officers. And real quick, the British officers are being killed off. The highest ranking person is a colonial volunteer by the name of George Washington. And our great George Washington emerges into history and takes his place upon history at this time. He gets the soldiers together, and they cut down some trees real fast and make what's called Fort Necessity, which is not much of a fort there, but they get some protection. And he surrenders. The British then tell him, make them give an oath and say, you'll never fight us again here, all right, and you can go back to Virginia. So they give an oath and they go back to Virginia. Guess what happens after that?
Fight again.
No, he stays out of the war. He gave an oath. He wasn't going to fight. He's a man of his word. But for our military leader of George Washington, he emerges on the history by doing what?
Surrendering.
Yeah, surrendering. Now, here's where I'm going to go a little bit more in this. What reason personally did Washington have to lead the troops? A lot of times we make our founding fathers demigods. But this Ohio River Basin, George Washington was part of a group of investors that had hundreds of thousands of acres that they had. If the French owned that land, would they get any money back from their investments?
Nope.
And they would lose it. George Washington was only a small part of this. He actually did the surveying of it earlier in his life. And a lot of the wealthier people said, you better go out there and help protect us. And that's why he's leading the volunteers, the militia, with the redcoats or the British officers there. So he personally has some financial stake, which will come back later on into this. Now, early on I went over this. It is called the French and Indian War, but what are the real sides? Again, it's Britain versus who?
The world.
Yeah, pretty much everyone. Britain, the colonies, and a few Indian tribes against everyone. But Britain emerges. Now, for those of you the military side, which really isn't important for us for American history, William Pitt will end up taking over, was the biggest battle at Quebec. It's actually militarily an interesting battle to study the tactics that William Pitt does, which he actually ends up where it is an impenetrable fort, long area you had to go in, and he found basically a way to come up the cliffs on the back side. Before that, he had defeated the British at Fort Duquesne. And he asked, so what city today was Fort Duquesne when the French had it? When William Pitt. Pittsburgh. We're not going to keep the French name there. The Duquesne University is in Pittsburgh therefore. What ends up happening eventually in 1763, the Treaty of Paris is signed. France surrenders. Spain surrenders. The Netherlands surrender. They all surrender. Now, here is where the physical aspect actually turns. Here is before the war. All this area in blue belongs to France. All this area in yellow belongs to Spain. This is the middle grounds that we're fighting over. Afterwards, notice Britain grows a little bit.
Dang.
The French lose Canada. They lose all the Mississippi River. They lose that area they're fighting over. And Spain loses Florida. And England then takes over Florida. And for 20 years, Florida would actually be split into two colonies, East and West Florida, and we would be under the English flag. And Britain gets the Ohio River Valley, which is what they're fighting over, which the Americans are happy because can we move out west now into that Ohio River Valley that we've been fighting over?
No.
No, we can't because the British passed the Proclamation of 1763.
Our one time we keep our word to the Indians.
Which the British, again, they as Glenn had said in here from your events, the British kept the word because they told the Indians, if we win this, we'll let you keep this land. But the Americans said, wait a minute, we fought for this land, but we're not allowed to move there. Daniel Boone's not happy. What do you think George Washington and his investors feel about that they can't move out to the land they invested in, or people can't move out there?
They're mad.
And not only can they not move to it, which quite upset to them, some of the other effects of the war, which will be the beginning of the next section.
They're making the people who fought it pay for it.
Right, we're going to have to pay for it. And then we get to the next thing where we're going to have the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and all of these taxes added on to pay for the war that we fought for the land that we're not allowed to move to. And how will we Americans feel about that?
Mad.
And that's why I will say we get to what is in more of the American history. That is the end of that section.